Ring roads, orbitals, beltways, whatever you want to call them, they're a striking feature of a lot of US cities. And, well, I have opinions. All about beltways, unintended consequences, or maybe they are intended, I don't know. And sort of a hall of shame, coming up next. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. Viewer suggested topics, always welcome, and I do get questions on this. How about making a list of US cities with the most ring roads? What are the busiest beltways in the States? I do want to point out that both of these suggestions are over a year old, just to emphasize that, yeah, I do hang on to these because sometimes I just want to make a video about something hideous. And I'm not going to do exactly the ideas that were suggested in these comments, but I do find the concept of beltways fascinating, and I am just going to stick with the term beltway as much as possible because that's the term we usually use in the US. These things do go by different names in different parts of the world, but the general concept for today is just a freeway that encircles a city. Later in the video, I'm going to get a little more into the why and the technical rationale for these things. But first, let's take an extended global tour so we can collectively grasp the awful tyranny of the Beltway, because it is an idea that's been inflicted on large cities on basically every continent, even cities we think of as progressive and forward-thinking. Let's start with maybe the most famous ring road in the world, the Périphérique in Paris. It basically forms the city limits proper, and all the radial freeways coming into the city terminate there. So you don't get freeways in the middle of the city, which is really how it should be. So that's a pretty tame example and probably about as unobjectionable as you're gonna get. On the other end of the spectrum, you get something like Moscow. There are at least 3 concentric freeways here, not to mention several ring stroads. Even the Moscow subway has a ring line. You're going to notice as I go through this that some of the cities that have the most rings are also cities with the worst traffic. I can't say for sure what the direction of causality is here, but I am going to come back to this subject later in the video. Speaking of which, Beijing has, I don't know, I'm counting 6 beltways. Just stupendous. Jakarta is finishing up its 4th ring road. You can see the quote-unquote progress in aerials. These are all megacities, but your city doesn't have to be that big to justify just arbitrarily encircling it with freeways. I love Saudi Arabia. They just literally number their beltways. Like, yeah, number 4 is finally gonna fix it. Although, to be fair, Mecca is gonna have some very wild seasonal traffic, so maybe I shouldn't judge. Honestly, even extremely bike and pedestrian friendly cities like Copenhagen are on this list. Motor Ring 3, Motor Ring 4, not to mention our progressive neighbors to the north. A lot of the prairie cities look like Edmonton. Edmonton, for my US viewers who are unfamiliar with it, is kind of just Indianapolis with less auto racing and more ice hockey. Let's go ahead and do a quick survey of US cities that have just really gone overboard with the Beltway idea. And it is one of these things where the idea is understandable on the face of it. You want to provide routes for drivers so they can get from point A to point B without clogging up the center of the city. One thing you'll notice is true coastal cities, by definition, don't really have them. I mean, Baltimore makes a really game effort, and so does Norfolk or Hampton Roads or whatever we're calling it. I'm not really focusing on central city loops today, which are a type of ring road, because I kind of did that in my freeway heavy downtowns video, and I really wanted to focus on the more heinous beltways that promote suburban sprawl in our finest metro areas. Anyway, having a true beltway in a place like Kansas City would just be redundant when it's already got freeways like everywhere. There are famous beltways like DC's. There are smaller cities that seem to have a ridiculously disproportionate amount of beltway mileage like Richmond. But Texas, as always, is the place where everything is bigger. Well, at least the unpleasant and obnoxious things. Dallas and Fort Worth each have their own beltway systems, and they sort of merge to create a belt ellipse. San Antonio is definitely a leader in this sort of heinous network design. It's like they wanted to duplicate Moscow's amazing land use and transportation planning, except with like a tenth of the population. But the national champ has to be Houston. I believe Highway 8, the Sam Houston Tollway at 88 miles long, is the longest completed beltway in the nation, but it's considered Houston's quote-unquote intermediate beltway. I actually had to research all this madness just to try to make sense of it. The I-10/I-45/I-69 ring around downtown is not considered a beltway, which is fine, I guess. I-610, about 5 miles out from downtown, is considered the inner beltway. And then Highway 8 is 10 or 12 miles out. That's intermediate. And then State Highway 99, like 20 to 25 miles out, is considered the outer beltway. The outer beltway is only partial, but I'm pretty sure when it finally gets completed, it's gonna solve Houston's traffic problems once and for all. Okay, I'm gonna get into just how insane this is and how the modeling tools we use practically guarantee we're gonna keep building stuff like this, especially in Texas. But first, usual reminder to like and subscribe if you wanna trick this app into spreading my propaganda to an ever larger audience. Connect on various websites. I do have a couple backups to the Bird app in case that thing actually becomes completely unusable, but I am pretty active there. Patreon, actually an excellent way to connect to, since I tend to read just about everything patrons send me. Okay, so TxDOT is still building Houston's outer beltway, State Highway 99, as far as I can tell. So the school of thought that says concentric freeways are a great idea and they'll relieve congestion on the more direct routes through the central city is still a pretty dominant school of thought. And it's not just Texas that's building them. North Carolina DOT is putting a couple billion into the Winston-Salem Northern Beltway. Nebraska DOT is all in on a Lincoln South Beltway. That's right, Lincoln, Nebraska is just crying out for a beltway. I love the background. The initial concept of a beltway around the city of Lincoln arose in the 1960s. Due to inadequate funding, the concept slowly evolved over the past 6 decades. I don't know if evolve is the verb I'd use here, but anyway. This is exactly what you build when your state DOT is still acting like it's the middle of the 20th century. And look, I know a lot of you probably play city building video games, and sure enough, there are tutorial videos with over 100,000 views that will tell you what a great idea beltways are for your city. And maybe they do make sense in that context. I'm not familiar with the game engine, but here's the thing. The idea that a new beltway or any kind of bypass will simply draw traffic off of previously congested existing freeways seems very intuitive and very logical. It's kind of the plumbing paradigm of traffic engineering, where there's a fixed volume you're trying to accommodate and you're just adding capacity to engineer out the clogs. And it's one more of these things that seems like common sense as long as you don't think about it too hard. The problem is, land use and transportation and the interaction between them is always much, much more dynamic than that. Let's go back to our beltways in Houston. Keep in mind, the Houston region is infamous for having basically no zoning, not much land use planning, and a very market-driven approach to land development. So what happens when you build a new beltway in a region like that? Well, I think it was Donald Shoup who said that off-street parking requirements are like a fertility drug for cars. Well, beltways 25 miles outside the city are like a fertility drug for car-dependent sprawl. It is a region where you can basically build anything anywhere, including housing like 25 miles outside the city in a green field. There's certainly no urban growth boundary. So just keep in mind when someone tries to tell you how great it is that Houston has so little government intervention and such relatively inexpensive housing, What it really means is you have to use a lot more of your budget on transportation because everyone here owns a car, often more than one, and then all of a sudden your cheap location isn't that cheap anymore. And the Houston region has one of the highest vehicle miles traveled per capita. So you're not only spending more of your money, you're spending more of your time driving from one far-flung location to another. Okay, enough picking on Houston because way too many US cities have this same problem. And I think it all originates from just the way regional traffic models work. You plug in some new freeway links to bypass congestion, and the model estimates that traffic will shift to the new route just like you hope it will. The thing with regional models, though, is they tend to systematically underestimate the induced traffic you get when you add new capacity, which I've talked about in another video, but they do even worse when it comes to estimating any kind of longer-term land use impact or induced sprawl, or whatever you want to call it. Sometimes this stuff just doesn't get modeled at all because it's too complex and too hard to forecast. So you end up with models that overestimate benefits and underestimate impacts. Well, if your regional decision makers even care about the impacts in the first place. Okay, I'm basically at the end of the video and I can't believe I let Atlanta off the hook. Definitely one of the most repulsive and sprawl-inducing beltlines in the US. And I would strongly encourage other US cities not to copy Atlanta, well, unless it's this kind of beltline, then it's all good. And that is all I've got. Thanks for joining, and as always, thanks to the patrons for continuing to make this a marginally viable profession. The direct support really does make it possible for me to keep releasing content every Wednesday. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next Wednesday, and I'll see you then.